What's up, miniature painters? The white Polypous thing is the perfect subject for a sludge wash. This creature is essentially a collection of nondescript bubbles and bulges. This will allow me to slap some color on the mini quickly and then rely on a thick oil wash to add some depth and color separation to the piece. Welcome to Treehane Miniatures. Because of the form factor that we're working with here, I'm considering only two methods of paint application for these base layers. First is dry brush application, much like I demonstrated on the Dole last week, where I built up the base colors in a series of diminishing dry brush steps, much like the underpainting for Slap Chop. The other consideration would be the airbrush, where you apply the colors in a sort of zenithal highlight fashion. For today's video, I am choosing to go with the airbrush because I find it a little more enjoyable to work with than dry brushing, and because I just demonstrated dry brushing with an oil wash in last week's video. I'm beginning with a miniature that is fully primed in black, and to that I'm going to add a dark brown base layer over the entire miniature. I'm only going to use 3 colors through the airbrush today. All 3 of these paints are Vallejo model air paints, so I'm going to thin them with just 3 or 4 drops of thinner per drop of paint. This may sound like a lot of thinner for an airbrush specific paint, but this is what I found to work best for me. After I get one complete layer over the miniature, I'll apply a second layer to increase the opacity everywhere except for the downward facing features underneath the upper torso. Next, I'll prepare an olive green in the same manner as the dark brown and continue to build up the colors on the model. I'm spraying this olive green slightly from above and at a shallow angle. This layer will cover most of the dark brown that came before, but the dark brown will remain visible in any downward facing areas or recesses. The more a bubble or protrusion faces upward, the more I will build the opacity there. If using dry brushing for the initial layers, the layers would be built up in the same way as slap chop preparation. Only instead of black, gray, and white, I'm using dark brown, olive green, and off-white. Vallejo Dead Flesh will be used for our off-white or light tan color, and is prepared for the airbrush with 4 drops of thinner for every drop of paint. This layer is sprayed from above at a much steeper angle than the previous color. This is similar in technique as painting zenithal highlights, where each lighter color gets sprayed at a steeper angle from above. For the lower pseudopod bits, I do have to get closer to the mini from the side because the slimy feet are blocked by the large torso from above. When viewed from above, this color looks a little overwhelming on the model, but when viewed from the side, all of the depth of the shadow can be seen. At the last moment, I decided that this thing could use a little more color, so I'm choosing some magenta pro acryl to use very sparingly on some of the bulges to make them look a little irritated, like they're in a state of continued swelling. This magenta paint is pretty thick, so I'm thinning it with approximately 10 drops of thinner for every drop of paint. The thinner the paint is, the more control I have over building up the intensity of the color. I'm only applying this color to the centralized bulges on the very upper part of the back. This paint is thin enough that I'm easily able to build it up to full intensity of the pink in only a very small area of each cyst. I think that taking just a minute to add this additional detail adds some much needed color variety to an otherwise oversimplified paint scheme. And now that we're all done with the airbrush, it's time to move on to the oil wash. I'm making a purple oil wash with 4 parts alizarin crimson to 1 part phthalo blue, and to that I'm adding 5 parts mineral spirits to every 1 part oil paint. This will make a wash that flows easily onto the model but still has a significant amount of opacity. This great glob of opaque paint obscuring every detail on the model can look a little scary at first, but this is what makes an oil wash so unique. The beauty of an oil wash is that it's a reductive technique, meaning that the final look of the wash is achieved by removing or reducing some of the oil wash that is initially placed on the model. There is no chance of having unwanted side effects like coffee staining or excessive color staining like can happen with an acrylic wash. Any unwanted oil wash can easily be removed with a little mineral spirits. Once this is all covered, I let it sit for about 10 minutes before beginning the removal process. I have some very flimsy makeup sponges that I like to use for this step, as well as some small makeup applicators. Q-tip cotton swabs are another inexpensive and readily available alternative to the small makeup applicators that works just about as well. One small issue with the cotton swab is that it can leave stray strands of cotton stuck to the piece. Not a big deal if it's noticed and removed before the oil is dry. Even though there appears to be an egregious amount of oil to remove, it's important to take a very gentle approach to removing this wash. I allow the sponge to flex freely as it's moved over the surface of the model. It's better for me to make several light passes over an area than to make one heavy pass with the sponge. I don't want to run the risk of removing the acrylic paint below. This reductive technique is more time consuming than simply using an acrylic wash, but I believe that the benefits outweigh the cost of the extra time. To brighten up the most raised surfaces, I switch to the small makeup applicator to remove a little more oil. I dampen this with a little mineral spirits and use it where I want the color to return to that of the original acrylic layer. The added contrast and amount of depth that this simple oil wash adds to the piece is significant. Next, I jump right into the acrylic highlight colors to add even more contrast between the deep shadows that I just put in and the ultimate highlights that we're about to create. Dead flesh is the perfect initial highlight for the oil stained dead flesh below. These are some of the easiest highlights that I've ever added to the miniature as I work my way around the upper torso, just hitting all of the ridges that surround the pink pustules. Since there isn't much to do on the upper back detail-wise, most of my time is spent adding little highlights around the eyes. Next, I jump straight to pure ice yellow for the final highlight. Again, I prioritize highlighting the features around the eyes. These are small highlights that are placed sparingly. I'm going to paint the eyeballs quite bright, so I want some of the surrounding area to remain dark for more contrast. For the back, I simply dot this ice yellow within the existing dead flesh highlights. On the pink cysts populating the back, I'm using a mix of ice yellow and magenta to begin highlighting. I use this to draw a series of small strokes and dots in the upper central portion of each swelling. I hope that this application of paint will make it look like light is actively reflecting off the surface of these irritated bumps. Then I do the same thing with ice yellow. This is the final highlight for the body before we move on to the eyes. These small highlights are placed at the very peak of each fluke, and the jump-in value should make these blemishes look like shiny, swollen zits about to burst. Sculpt-wise, these eyes might look a little boring, but they were by far my favorite part of this miniature to paint. I want these luminescent green eyes to appear very bright when they're all done, so I begin with a base coat of bold titanium white by Monument Hobbies. Really, any matte white or white ink will work. I recommend painting this brightest feature as the very last step in the paint job. It was necessary for me to do this last to avoid any mess made by the oil wash. This has one downside in that I need to be very careful with the application of this white paint layer so that it doesn't mar any of the surrounding areas that are already completely finished. After all of the eyes have a nice coat of white on them, I'm going to take a few seconds to scratch in some bright spots on the dripping ooze that's emanating from below the eyes. I'm going to use a different progression of colors on the ooze so that it will not be quite as bright as the eyes when it's all done. Now I paint all of the white areas with Orc Skin Speed Paint. For the ooze, I'm applying this green speed paint well above the white highlighted area. This will create a more gentle transition to the colors found on the rest of the body. I can also achieve this look by thinning down any dark green acrylic paint such as army paint or green skin. We aren't really using the speed paint for its speed paint properties, but more as a dark green tint that will work as a starting layer for the subsequent effects. For the eyes, I want to cover them in their entirety without any staining or pooling on the smooth central surface of the eye. Any pooling that occurs in the recesses surrounding the eyeball is fine. I'm going back to the titanium white for some smaller highlights within the green areas. I have this thinned a little with water this time because I want good coverage with it, but I don't need it to be completely opaque. I'm drawing some good-sized white circles in the eyes, but I'm leaving some green visible all the way around these circles. On the oozing goo, I'm drawing some white highlights within the boundaries of the existing highlights, which are still visible beneath the green speed paint. Now we start building the glow. I'm using Daler Rowney fluorescent green ink to glaze the eyes green. Any brand of fluorescent ink or acrylic paint is going to be much more translucent than standard colors, so thinning probably isn't necessary no matter what brand is chosen. Use your own discretion here. From here on out, the eyes and ooze are painted differently, so only the eyes get painted with fluorescent colors. The seeping discharge gets a coat of Army Painter Jungle Green. I typically enjoy using Army Painter colors, but this Jungle Green is truly the worst excuse for paint I've ever seen in my life. Even calling it paint is a stretch. It is absolutely incapable of achieving any reasonable level of opacity no matter how many coats get applied. I'm using this lack of opacity as a strength in this situation to paint it as the final highlight over the white bits of goop. I take this all the way up to the top of each dribble to blend it towards the body colors. I'm painting this on at full thickness with no thinning, which still allows the white to brightly show through. It's an absolute cakewalk from here. I'm using titanium white to paint an even smaller bright circle within the bright green area. I'm going for a smooth, even layer, but once again, complete opacity isn't necessary with these white highlights. I take the green glow up a notch with some fluorescent yellow ink. An interesting observation about fluorescent yellow paints is that it actually has a slight green tint to it. I noticed this when photographing the flames that I painted on Rasputin. I was kind of mortified at first, but ultimately this is a fantasy world we're building here, so anything goes. Or maybe he's just burning barium. With this information, I'm able to use this fluorescent yellow to highlight the green without the risk of turning the eyes yellow. Finally, I'm going to add a little titanium white dot within this yellow to give each eye one ultimate bright point. The white is still thinned with water so that it blends smoothly with the surrounding colors. And that wraps up the eyes and ooze on the white Polypous thing for the Cthulhu Death May Die board game. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of painters.